And then we'll stop our own videos when we start.
Yeah, and let's
Might as well
I'll
do
stay
that now.
muted as well. Okay, welcome everybody. I'm going to go ahead and share slides here. Okay, I'm going to assume everybody can see that. Let me know if not. Welcome to the Teaching Ethics Across the Curriculum panel. I'm joined by a fantastic group of panelists and presenters. So I'm just going to go ahead and jump on in here. The idea for this panel arose with the LSA Ethics Committee that I have chaired since 2018. One of our biggest projects during that time was revising the LSA Ethics Statement, which had last been updated in 2009. That 2009 statement grew out of an ad hoc ethics committee that was established in 2006 by the LSA Executive Committee. And it was charged with the task of drafting new guidelines for the responsible conduct of research. So the process of revising the most recent statement to this version took a little bit over a year. First, the committee identified areas that we wanted to update based on our own knowledge of key areas or expertise in those key issues. And this included members who had served on their university's institutional review boards. The committee's working draft then received comments from the LSA Executive Committee, followed by a 3-month period during which the draft was hosted on the LSA website to receive open feedback and comments from LSA members, which were then incorporated into the draft. Final suggestions were then incorporated from the EC before the revised ethics statement was officially approved in July 2019. And that is the link that you see on your screen on the LSA website. Subsequently, one of the goals of the Ethics Committee has been to further engage the LSA membership with the revised ethics statement and with the topic of ethics just in general as well. And so a core group of us proposed to host this panel today, which focuses on one key area in which many linguists incorporate attention to ethics, which is in their classrooms through teaching. So I want to make sure that I thank the folks on this slide because, of course, these issues and attentions are not only the purview of the Ethics Committee itself. So thanks to the Committee on Endangered Languages and Their Preservation, Linguistics in Higher Education, and the Scholarly Teaching LSA Special Interest Group, in addition to the LSA Ethics Committee. So thank you all for helping endorse and spread the word about today's panel. So let me just give you a brief overview of today's topics. First, we'll review some key issues that are represented in the revised 2019 ethics statement and that have strong potential for inclusion across the linguistics curriculum. And then we'll have 3 presentations that will cover teaching ethics in the experimental linguistics curriculum, the language documentation curriculum, and the natural language processing curriculum. And after that, we'll open things up for discussion and Q&A. Please feel free to put any questions for the panelists and presenters at any point in the Q&A box, and we'll be able to follow along, although we may wait to answer those until the end. Okay, so I'm going to turn things over now to Mike Cahill to kick us off on this introductory paper.
All right, I'm very glad to be here. I'm Mike Cahill. Mike will see if you really want to get formal about it, from SIL International. And it's not on the slides, but it struck me that one thing you might want to do is just raise a question with your students of why bother with ethics in the first place. And for some, the answer might seem obvious, but perhaps not. I think a lot of the answer would depend on your worldview and background. So if you have one end of the spectrum as a purely materialistic utilitarian point of view, then if you're acting consistently with that, then you might be ethical only if and when you benefit from it. Or if your worldview is more Judeo-Christian, then people have inherent worth. And if you're acting consistently with that, then you want to act ethically, even if you don't get any practical benefit. And of course, there's other positions worth thinking about, I think. For this introductory here, the panelists will be covering these in more detail with their specialties, but just kind of an overview of these. The first key concept is informed consent, and this is crucial in both the old and the new versions, the 2019 versions. And this is summarized as in the slide. Linguists are responsible for obtaining the informed consent of, and there's a difference between 29 and 2019, which says those who provide them with data and participants. And this really is indicative of a little different philosophy over the years, that the new version expounds more fully on responsibilities to participants and talking about them, the sources of data, as actually being full partners and participants in the whole process. So actively seeking to involve participants in research, ensuring their benefit from it, and not only avoiding direct harms, but also potential misinterpretation and negative unintended consequences. That's the whole thing about informed consent. So what do we mean about informed? Consent is a little checkoff box, although that's not quite as simple as it sounds. But what do we mean by informed? Methodology, what are you going to be doing? What risk may exist? And these are relatively small in most linguistic research, but not always. And their option to withdraw at any point without any negative consequences. You should know about how it will be used, and the participants should know their rights to limit access to their information by other people as well. Next slide. So one of the things about informed is this can be hugely different depending on your audience, the participants. Local university students have been raised at least somewhat with this. They have an idea about that. But if you're doing an experiment or gathering data from your local university students, this can be quite different than doing some field work with minority language speakers who may or may not be aware of larger issues. What if they don't speak English? You don't have a form. What example? So here's a form that we've used in SIL for an Indonesian interpretation. But what if they're not even literate or can't sign a form there? You may need a translated document, but what happens if they're illiterate altogether? This is extreme again, but this is not uncommon in fieldwork, and Jorge will be talking a little bit more in detail about that. You may need to bring up the possibility of a recorded conversation for informed consent rather than a form. And it will have the same information, but it will be in a way that can be more easily accessible to the local participants there. Next slide. Now, the other thing is we are very individualistic in our society. And one of the things we can overlook because of our own cultural biases, the point of view from local speakers. I'm biased in view of field methods, informed consent. But here's something from the LSA 2919, the local, our most recent instantiation of the ethics policy. So in many communities, responsibility for linguistic and cultural knowledge is viewed as collective, so that individual community members are not in a position to consent to share materials with outsiders. And linguists must try to determine whether there are individuals who can legitimately represent the community in working out the terms of research. This is a little bit of a foreign concept to us as individualistic Westerners, but it's something that needs to be taken into account in some particular circumstances. Next slide. Some of these ethics principles really might strike students as a bit strange because of our own background, counterintuitive, unnecessary, but this is a chance to stretch them a bit too. So the second key concept after informed consent is confidentiality. And so linguists pretty much, our ethics statement from 2009 and 2019 is pretty identical. So linguists are responsible for maintaining any expected confidentiality in storing data and reporting findings there. So this is for the participants. Now, 2019 adds a little bit more, is maintaining confidentiality in contexts that require it. So it's in the context of working with colleagues, but this is something that I think the linguistic community as a whole and IRBs have grown, and they realize that the confidentiality requirements that were required and absolutely fine for medical research may not be applicable to linguistics research. As a matter of fact, in SIL, we've had cases where one of our field workers working to get a graduate degree says, oh, my IRB has said I can't let other people know the name of my source of data. And this local speaker said, what? I want to be known. I'm helping you on this. Okay, that's a different situation than medical research. So we assume confidentiality for some types of research. Medical is the prototype of the case. But again, like I said, some linguistic research, the participants actually want to be recognized. So next slide. Now, as you might expect, informed consent and confidentiality intersect in many cases there. What about anonymous observations of public behavior? And these cannot really involve consent. But on the other hand, as far as do no harm principle, we really should have no information that could inadvertently identify individuals, or where sensitive, even the whole community. And there are some communities that are more sensitive to sharing cultural information, language information. It's theirs. Don't even ask us about publicizing it. Now, the 2019 version says that this kind of observation and public behavior should be, quote, thoroughly vetted with research ethics boards. And of course, this is something that hopefully you'll have a chance to discuss this for individual research projects. But when you're talking about this with a class, for example, linguistics curriculum, this is something to bring up as well. I think that finishes my slide here. Thank you.
Sorry, now I'm unmuted. Thanks so much, Mike. I'm going to continue with this thread by talking about 2 two additional related concepts of authorship and publication where we made some expansions in the revised ethics statement. So there's a section 4, called Additional Responsibilities to Students, Colleagues, and the Discipline. And one of the key pieces that we have included in this section is that linguists should promote and model ethical behavior in all of our professional activities, which includes working with students. So this includes making sure that our relationships with students at all levels are fair and equitable, civil, non-coercive, non-exploitative, due in large part to the fact that there are hierarchical relationships between teaching faculty and students. And this includes direct instruction, research supervision, thesis committee membership, collaboration, and so on. When it comes to authorship and publication, we mentioned properly acknowledging any and all contributions of students and other collaborators to research, which includes, making sure that you adhere to established standards for attribution and standards of authorship. It also includes making sure that students are appropriately instructed in ethical research practices. Advance the slide there, as well as instructing students in the academic practices of not plagiarizing, maintaining confidentiality in contexts that require it, reporting results with rigor, citing carefully, ensuring that we follow through on promises made in funded grant proposals and so forth. And some of those may be more or less applicable in different student contexts. And things like promoting respectful interchange of ideas in the classroom. And then finally, fairly presenting findings of linguistic research to student audiences, including public audiences as well. So again, there's the link to the revised ethics statement, and the committee encourages linguists to share the 2019 ethics statement with your students and to incorporate it into your teaching. And it's a great moment to have your students go through it and talk about some of the key issues that are included. So what we're going to do in the remainder of the panel is there will be 3 presentations that will give examples of how linguists have talked about some of the key components of the revised LSA ethics statement in their teaching across different subfields of linguistics. So I will go ahead and turn it over to them while also mentioning that we're going to have a good robust half hour for Q&A at the end as well. Okay.
All right, thank you so much, Christine and Mike, for starting us off. Can go to the next slide. So today I'm going to talk, Alina and I are going to talk about teaching ethics in the experimental linguistics curriculum. Both of us teach experimental syntax, so it is, centered around that, our experiences with that. And one theme that you'll see is that as we talk about shifting how we think about teaching experimental methods, we're also trying to shift how we think about experimental methods more broadly. As the first presentation talked about, we're thinking about harm reduction and that way of thinking about ethics as a starting point, and centering ethical practices towards the communities we work with and towards each other. And we'll also talk a little bit about data management, open science, and responsible analysis as it's related to experimental linguistics. So today I'm going to start with some big ideas and talk about how we've sort of reframed things in my experience. And then Elaine's going to introduce an activity that she's used to practice these skills in the classroom and in the lab. Next slide, please. All right, so the first thing is thinking about the inclusion of psycholinguistics in languages and psycholinguistics in general. So psycholinguistics has an inclusion problem when it comes to participants, languages and varieties, and practitioners. And this has been written about, but there's a lot more to be done. And this is not just a problem for our science. So something that psychologists have talked about with weird psychology, but we're thinking of this also as an ethical concern. Next slide, please. So the first thing that that I start with in classes, and something that maybe we don't think about a lot in experimental methods courses, is asking actually, should we even be doing an experiment? Is that actually the right thing to be doing in this context? So depending on the context that you're working in, it might not be the most appropriate use of our participants' time. And the output of certain types of experiments, like reaction times, might not be an appropriate contribution to the communities that we are working in. So this is especially as we're trying to expand the languages and communities involved in experimental work. This is something that's really important to think about. And I want to credit Megan Lukaniak as someone who's thought about this and talked about this. I was lucky to talk to her about this at a panel a couple years ago, thinking about experimentation and documentation. So analogous topics like this have been discussed with regard to language documentation, but not so much in experimental methods courses. So we're encouraging that we, actually start talking about this itself. Next slide, please. And in our courses, we want to think about designing for inclusion. So when we're reading papers and discussing best practices, it's a great way to get these conversations started is to ask, is the design systematically excluding or marginalizing certain participants, and who are those participants? So one type of way that we can think about this is the context of experimental items. So thinking about culturally appropriate or representative items, avoiding harmful stereotypes. This is something that linguists have talked about with example sentences. And I'll give one example myself. So I did experimental work on Malayalam as spoken in Kerala, and some of the items had names, and I wanted to ensure that the names were representative of the diversity of religions and communities of the local community. So that's something that, is one way of designing for inclusion. Another aspect that can help with designing for inclusion is using audio stimuli. So one of our grad students, Jordan Steteros, and I wrote a paper about this recently, and thinking about how audio stimuli can be used to include more types of varieties and participants. And also using non-intrusive and robust to environmental noise and comfortable, especially for participants who are not typically the typical maybe experimental participants that we think about, like our undergraduate participant pools. Next slide, please. And then when we recruit and describe participants, we want to think about how we're doing this, and that we're being ethical in the way that we describe our participants. So one thing that has resulted in a lot of exciting discussion, actually a paper a manuscript that we're almost ready to circulate with some University of Michigan graduate students, is thinking about concepts that are under-theorized within psycholinguistics, like native speakers. So this is a concept that has been heavily theorized in adjacent fields, but not really sort of problematized as much within our field. So we've talked about how this can be a problematic, vague term, and also it can carry often unwanted theoretical baggage. It can systematically exclude minoritized speakers or even most users of a particular language. So if we take sort of a monolingual centered or a spoken language centered view of native speaker, then we might be excluding almost all the users of sign languages, for example. And so alternatives that we propose in our work is to be specific about what you're interested in and ask questions of participants accordingly. And this work is something that came from discussions of this in classes. So that's something I wanted to highlight. Next slide, please. And of course, we want to really incorporate ideas about data management, responsible analysis practices, and open science into our curricula. So in lab setting and our methods courses, we want to include discussion of how we can ensure well-organized and transparent practices for data collection, coding, analysis, and reporting, avoiding misleading interpretation and reporting of results, and also balancing open science practices with privacy concerns. Although, so one thing I want to highlight is there has been some really well thought out critique of some of the hegemonic culture in open science as well. So if you're interested in more about that, you can look at the hashtag #GropinScience and some work and thoughts about that by scholars such as Olivia Guest and others. Next slide, please. And so one thing that comes up a lot, especially in experimental linguistics, is, we're in lab context. And so the way that we work collaboratively might look different than in other of our related fields. So it's important to discuss and make transparent power differentials, and not just within the structures of the academia, like professor, student, but also with participants and interactions with when we have various social positionalities. So what is my social positionality in relation to my participants and to students? It can be often not straightforward, or it can be a little complex. We want to make sure that everyone gets proper credit and compensation and that everyone's included. And so some scholars have talked about authorship as a way to enact equity and push against some of the inequities that we see in citation practices, for example. And one thing that we've recommended, and others have recommended as well, is co-creating a lab code of conduct along with other norms for data management. So when you're thinking about, well, how do we as a lab store our data or label our files, we can also talk about how do we treat each other and what is the appropriate way to communicate with each other. And also practicing reviewing and responding to reviewer comments in constructive ways. So we wanted to highlight places where we see harmful behavior and unethical behavior and try to get practice in pushing against some not good practices. And so one important thing that we wanted to mention is accountability. So it's really important. I mean, we have these practices, but I think we all really need to think about what does accountability look like? So discussing and enacting robust practices to report when things aren't going as they should is really crucial at different levels. So within the classroom, within a lab, within a department, within the university, at a field site. But also, the LSA itself is thinking about this and how this might look within our field, right? So this is a huge ongoing conversation that we need to have. Next slide, please. And so now I'm going to shift it over to Elaine, who's going to talk about putting these things into practice with a specific activity.
Hi, everybody. Can you see me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Savi. I just want to say before I start that teaching this course at the LSA Institute with Savi, I have learned so much about teaching and research and ethics in particular. So I just want to thank her for that. So this is an activity that I have used in my experimental syntax classes over the last several years. And it's a worksheet of scenarios asking the students to take the perspective of some role, such as the PI, a graduate student, a participant, an undergraduate, et cetera, and think about what they would do in a different situation. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to go over 3 examples, and then there's a link in the slides to a sample worksheet that I've used. The first one is imagine that you're a grad student and one of your committee members gives you advice on the experiment design of your thesis project. Your advisor disagrees with the advice and instructs you to ignore it. You worry that the committee member will not pass your thesis if you do not follow their advice. What should you do? So here, these scenarios are purposefully vague because it's going to invite the students to fill in the details, the other information that they would need to know in order to make an informed decision on a scenario like this. The key concepts would be power differentials, conflict management, and problems defining scientific best practices. So they're going to come up with, well, is the committee member's advice reasonable, and are they an expert So that would be the first thing that they would need to ask in order to answer a question like that. Next slide, please. A second example, another vague one. You're reviewing anonymous abstracts for a regional conference hosted by your university. So this is again a grad student. One of the abstracts contains example sentences that are intended to be humorous, but include offensive ethnic and gender-based stereotypes. You suspect the author is a well-known professor. What do you do? So here again, some of the same key concepts as the other one, but also there's, the presence or absence of clear conference guidelines is going to be a big piece of information that the student's going to need to know in order to respond appropriately to this kind of scenario. Next slide, please. And the last one, I asked them to imagine they're in their first job as an assistant professor. And one of the grad students has been working on an independent project in collaboration with a grad student from another lab who's a speaker of the language of analysis. Your student who is not a speaker of the language has a disagreement with the other student about the design of the stimulus materials and comes to you for advice. You had not previously been involved in the project. What should you do? So this is to get them thinking about all these power issues, conflict management, and then another key concept is academic freedom. I know a lot of professors disagree as to how much academic freedom their trainees should have separately from their work in the lab. So next slide, please. So that's all we have for this section. Design your courses and experiments with ethics in mind. And there's a link in this slides to a sample worksheet if anybody would like to have it. Thank you.
Elaine, do you think you could also put that link into the chat for folks if you're able?
Sure.
Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Mike and Christine, for getting us started, and Savi and Elaine for their presentation. We are kind of shifting gears to go to the language documentation curriculum. Next slide. The last 3 decades have seen a rebirth of language documentation efforts across the world, stemming primarily from a concern for the long-term maintenance of minoritized, often indigenous, but also non-indigenous languages. And while recent research in this subfield has focused on documentation best practices and archiving, it also has focused on ethics, which is really important for the purposes of today. Particularly, ethics has been discussed from the points of view of collaboration, of community involvement and engagement, and the applicability of ethical models to different parts of the world. And the references on the slides are only a subset of the publications treating these topics. One aspect that has remained under discussed is the pedagogy of ethics training for new generations of linguists interested in language documentation. Although notably here, it's important to say that Paul Newman wrote an article very early on in 1992 that was later published in 2009 in Language Documentation Conservation that used scenarios to discuss ethics. And he discussed actually the importance of teaching ethics. And there are other folks like Adrian Sikegwa who are looking at the place of ethics in the curriculum. There is an increasing number of learning and teaching resources available and numerous opportunities for teaching ethics both inside and outside the classroom, and that's what we're going to talk about. Next slide. Traditionally, the methodology for working with undocumented languages or under-researched languages has focused mostly on analysis, and the place within the curriculum has traditionally been field methods classes. The only exception I'm aware of is a University of Oregon, where there is an actual course on fieldwork methods and ethics, which is separate from the field methods class. But I would be happy to hear from others in the audience about whether they know of any universities that have ethics courses within a linguistics curriculum. However, A number of new offerings at universities all over North America, Europe, and other parts of the world has expanded the documentation curriculum to go beyond just field methods, to include classes on language endangerment, but also on documentation and revitalization, sometimes taught separately, sometimes taught together. There are also other training opportunities for language documentation outside of university programs. And these include things like CoLang, which was previously known as Infield, the Endangered Languages Documentation Program training course for their grantees, which has also been offered in a number of countries all over the world, and other venues such as Breath of Life Institutes and the International School on Linguistic Fieldwork organized by the CNRS in Paris. Next slide, please. In what follows, I'm gonna try to cover some general ideas and make concrete suggestions about how to teach ethics in the language documentation curriculum. These are based on my own experiences as a student and a teacher, as a non-Indigenous person in a North American educational context. For each of them, I will take into account three important contextual factors. Content, as Mike and Christine highlighted at the beginning, ethics is multifaceted and there's many different topics that we could cover. Perhaps an entire ethics course is needed, but there's generally not one offer, and it's also not feasible to offer one. So we have to choose wisely what to focus on. The second contextual factor is venue. There are clear differences between teaching in a university classroom and teaching, for example, at a training venue like CoLang, where there are also students, but community participants. And even within university classrooms, there may be significant differences based on the course and on the program. And the third one is the audience. The level of the students is of course important, but so is the composition of the student population. What I would suggest is that we scaffold our teaching on ethics, introducing things and then building on them slowly. And the suggestions here are geared towards the university classroom environment, but I would be happy to discuss similar training outside of a university classroom. Next slide, please. So here we have an activity for introducing ethics. This is the general content is linguist responsibility to communities, but to minority and endangered languages generally. The venue is the university classroom, and the audience is first or second year undergraduate students. In this particular case, students with no prereqs in linguistics. And the activity that we do in the endangered languages class is to have 3 in-class discussions spaced out throughout the term. Students are in groups. There is a team leader that has to submit an individual reading response. And then we have a collective group-based discussion in class, and the students write a response together. The readings are selected to answer specific questions. So we have, would the world be better off without linguistic diversity? And this is using Nancy Dorian's article on Western language ideologies and small language prospects. Should linguists do something to stem the tide of language loss? Here we have 2 opposing views, like the Focus article and Dorian article. And then what should be the role of linguists, if any, in the fight against endangerment? As you can see, these are kind of broad questions that serve to introduce a topic to an audience that doesn't have experience with it. Next slide, please. We have a couple of third-year courses that have the endangered languages course as a prereq. So this allows us to go a little bit further in the kind of topics that we can discuss. The content for this activity in particular is collaboration with communities. The venue is still a university classroom, and the audience now is upper level undergraduate students, and some graduate students also take the class. What the students do is write a written reflection, but we also hold a group in-class discussion. And the reading goes from being a broad discussion of particular topics, like in the previous slide, to being a specific case study. In this case, Wilkins' 1992 article on conducting fieldwork under Aboriginal control in Australia. And that allows you to move past basic questions to discuss things like who gets to set their research agenda, what is research and according to whom, and the role of a linguist in a language program. Next slide, please. When we have had a chance for our students to grapple with these kind of questions, we can then look into like applying ethics and doing it in a more practical way. Here, the content is informed consent and REB, IRB boards. Particularly, we're talking about a field methods class, but this could also be applied to students who have their own field projects. And the activity is a practical one rather than having an in-class discussion, and it's gathering consent with the speaker. The students will have read Jeff Ku's article, which gives an overview of the different ethical issues. Here, the Lsa Ethics Statement would also be a good reading. And they've also completed a research ethics tutorial. We do the core one because we're based in Canada, but there's similar ones in the US that I know are used as part of the Collaborative Institutional Training Initiative CT program. This allows students to see in practice things like informed consent, community priorities, data preservation into the future, and recognition of speaker contributions, anonymity versus credit versus intellectual property, moral rights. This is building on prior discussions that are more theoretical and making them practical, giving the students the option to see this in action. Next slide, please. What I want to suggest is that where feasible and desirable, we should also be thinking about making the classroom a collaborative space. So considering, especially for field methods classes, whether the class can make a contribution to a particular language community. I'm not going to go as far as to say that turn a field methods class into a service learning course, but there is very clear implications here for the service learning curriculum within linguistics as proposed by Fitzgerald 2010. I'm basing this on the class on field methods with Stony Nakota, which we partnered with the Paul First Nation. So we've been doing this for 2 years now. The work contributes directly to community efforts. For example, last winter, all the recordings of words and sample sentences were given back to the community for use in their online dictionary. And we select topics that are also a priority to the community. Last year, we selected some that were needed for refining the community orthography. The students in this way experience collaboration in action and contribute meaningfully to community needs, seeing many aspects of ethics in practice. Next slide, please. So I'll emphasize again that the ideas explored here and the suggestions I've made are based on my own teaching experience as a non-Indigenous person in a North American context. But I'll also mention that there are many others that are exploring similar avenues to teach ethics in the documentation curriculum or question the place of ethics in the curriculum. And Adrian Sikewa gave an excellent talk at the New York LSA a couple of years back on this topic. The LSA also has a special interest group, Native Linguistics, that has concrete ideas of how to engage meaningfully and ethically with Native and Indigenous languages. From the activities I've shown you here, they're all adaptable, but the important thing to take away is that there are contextual factors to take into account, like content, venue, and audience. The ethics should be introduced early. And I want to emphasize that this may be the only chance that you get to do that. For example, our endangered languages class takes students from all other programs on campus, but they don't necessarily continue into linguistics. But if you've been able to approach the topic at the beginning, then they go away with that knowledge. And to then scaffold that through the curriculum and if possible, give practical experience. I want to suggest to people teaching field methods that in particular, the Lsa Ethics Statement, the section 3 on responsibilities to communities will make for a great discussion piece. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much. We are now switching over to teaching ethics in the NLP, that is Natural Language Processing curriculum. I'm Emily Bender from the University of Washington, and I had the pleasure of working on this together with Xanda Schofield at Harvey Mudd College, who will also introduce herself when it gets to her slides. Next slide, please. So we started by talking to each other about why do we need ethics in natural language processing, and now I'm just going to start saying NLP because I'm in a rush. So NLP is typically studied as searching for optimal solutions to abstract problems. And this is typically as taught in computer science classes, but also in computational linguistics classes within a linguistics department. However, language technology can reproduce and amplify systems of oppression. And where we are now, as of 2021, and in fact, the past few years, we have these modern toolkits and prepackaged data sets that make it really easy for developers to not see the bias and other kinds of harm that can be built into those systems and put them out in the world and make a product out of it and deploy it very broadly. So it becomes very important to give NLP students the skills to think about how their work affects people and how to see the people on the other sides of the data sets and the applications. Next slide, please. One of our jumping off points is actually not the LSA's Code of Ethics, but the ACM, that's the Association for Computing Machineries Code of Ethics, which was adopted by the Association for Computational Linguistics in March of 2020. The Code of Ethics itself is older than that. It was initially created in 1973 and revised several times since. And one point that we found really meaningful is under 2.2, they talk about how having high standards of professional competence includes awareness of the social context in which their work may be deployed. And that when we are teaching people to become professionals in this field, it is part of our responsibility to provide them with the skills to get that awareness. Next slide, please. So what we're reporting back on here today is actually an interactive tutorial that we ran at the 2020 Association for Computational Linguistics Conference, Xanda and I together with Dirk Hovey, where it was a tutorial on teaching ethics in NLP, where we worked with the tutorial participants to think about what some of the ethical risks are of NLP technology, to think about what our desired outcomes are from incorporating this topic into the NLP curriculum, what are the challenges that we see in doing that. And then we did a long interactive session, in fact, a couple of sessions where our participants worked through and developed sample exercises and thought about how they related to different instructional contexts. And we are in the process of sharing out the results of that discussion to the ACL community at large via the ACL Wiki. Next slide, please. The first thing that we had to think about in designing that tutorial, but also in terms of thinking about how to teach this, is what is the teaching model? So is this a standalone required course where everybody who's studying NLP has a course on ethics? Is it a standalone elective course where people opt in to take a whole course on this topic? Both of those have some value, especially the standalone elective course, but we felt that it was also particularly important to integrate ethical considerations throughout the curriculum so that it's not, oh, ugh, the ethics course that we have to take that doesn't get taken seriously, but actually something that is related consistently as you go through all of the courses to all of the technology that's being studied and built. Next slide, please. So in the tutorial, we talked about three main kinds of ethical risks. This is not exhaustive, but it allowed us to structure what we were talking about and also related to each of our research interests. So I have a particular interest in how bias plays out in natural language technology. And there's various different kinds of bias, and it's worth thinking about where does it come from, and also what is the harm that it causes. And two important types, thinking about where does it come from, are emergent bias, which happens when you apply technology designed for one context or population with another. And so you can think there, for example, of creating speech recognition technology that works for a prestige variety and then putting it out in the world where it's supposed to serve the entire community and not everyone has equitable access, for example. Another important kind of bias is pre-existing bias, and that's patterns in the training data that are based on existing societal prejudices and attitudes that then get sucked into the pattern recognition technology and reproduced. And some key references are listed here. I particularly enjoy the Blodgett et al. Paper from this past summer's at ACL, where they looked at 146 different papers considering bias in NLP and took a very critical overview of to what extent are these papers actually situating the issues that they're studying with respect to the harm in the world and why they care about bias. So great paper. Next slide, please. The second overarching topic was dual use. And this is Dirk's specialty, so I'm going to try to channel Dirk here. It is a well-known point that every technology has an intended use and also unintended consequences. And you can think of everything from nuclear power to knives to electricity, all of which can be abused for things that they were not originally designed to do. And the ethicist Hans Jonas commented on the inevitability of use. If a technology is available, it will be used. And sometimes we hear people in computer science saying, well, too bad it's out there in the world. There's always the possibility of someone using it for harm. How is that my problem? I'm building it for this good purpose. But you can also look at it in the other direction and say, we don't know how people will use it, and we need to be aware of this duality, and we need to think about what the risks are so that from our informed standpoint as the technologists who develop the thing, we can inform the public, we can inform regulators, and we can be part of that discussion rather than just backing off and saying, well, not our fault, we're not using it that way. So that's the dual use topic. Next slide, please. The third topic is Xanda's specialty, and that's the topic of privacy. So I'm going to try to channel Xanda here for a moment. So privacy is a really interesting set of topics, partially because the lay notion of privacy is often not well suited to figuring out where the risks are. That is, people frequently conflate privacy with anonymity, but they're separate things. So privacy means nobody knows that I'm doing something, but anonymity means everyone knows what I'm doing, but not that it's me. You can see these are different. There's been a lot of work recently around how to react to GDPR. That is the General Data Protection Regulations, I'm not sure what the R is, in Europe, that requires us to anonymize data so that people cannot be identified, quote, without significant effort. But if we are building technology that allows us to identify author attributes or assume we've identified author attributes, given enough of those, that set is small enough to start identifying people. And so as we're building this technology that can do pattern recognition and correlate things in language, including speech, including sign, including text, with author attributes, we risk harming privacy in ways that are maybe not immediately clear, especially when you put multiple ones of these technologies together. And there's a bunch of interesting computer sciencey work here on theoretical and differential privacy as approaches to this. So there's opportunities to build things that can start addressing these issues as well. Next slide, please. We were inspired by Van de Poel's point that new technology can be conceived of as a large-scale experiment. And I think given current events, we can all see very much how we are living through that right now. And when we conceive of technology as a large-scale experiment, then we can apply the standards that we already have for deciding when it's reasonable to do the experiments, right? Around beneficence and respect for subjects' autonomy and justice. All of these things apply when we are putting technology out in the world, and we need our students to be able to reason through that. Next slide, please. So in our tutorial, we gave an overview of concepts from ethics, like what I was just talking through, but a bit longer, and also pedagogy. And then we had our participants break out into working groups for designing or adapting exercises, answering questions like, how does this adapt to your class format and composition? What preparation would students need and how would you provide it? And how would you assess student understanding from this exercise? And then we had our participants, this was all done online because 2020, submit their results via Google Forms so that we can start extracting the results of that and summarizing it. And I'm going to hand it over to Xanda to talk about where she is so far with that.
Thank you so much, Emily, and thanks for having me. Like Emily said, I'm Xanda Schofield. I'm actually a computer science professor. I teach NLP at Harvey Mudd College, and I'm delighted to be at basically my first LSA doing this. I wanted to highlight today a few of the conclusions that we got from our participants from the discussion and designs that they shared through this feedback form. And I will say that the structure of the feedback that we got varied pretty dramatically. So I'll share a link at the end to the ACL wiki page we have that summarizes some of what we've seen so far, that organizes it sort of into case studies, structures for assignments that engage with these case studies, and some broader reflections about what it means to teach this kind of material. First, one of the things that stuck out, and right now we're looking at this bias slide right here, was that the 3 different topics that we discussed elicited different kinds of learning outcomes and goals for the assignments, and therefore different structures. For instance, bias assignments often looked the most like what we would think of as a sort of standard computer science assignment, where you implement something and you analyze the outputs. using, say, existing metrics to measure gender or racial bias in existing models. For instance, the debiasing word embeddings work of like Robin Spear's ConceptNet. Some of the instructors did share some discomfort that introducing these metrics, as was sort of reflected on before, might convince students that this is an abstract problem that can be easily resolved, that bias existing in a model, if you can find a metric that says that there is no bias according to that metric, that means the model is unbiased, which means it's really important in these assignments to encourage students to have at least some reflection component for what these metrics might not be capturing. There were also concerns that it wasn't really realistic in any of these classrooms to assume that everyone was fundamentally on board with the idea that a deployed NLP model shouldn't reflect the bias of the speaker populations. How to set up a productive conversation around these real-world consequences of model bias can take some classroom-specific reflection on what it means to have a meaningful conversation about why we might want a model to be debiased, or in what cases we would want to study the bias within the speakers when you have an NLP model. Next slide, please. In contrast, for dual use, assignments often very much focus not on implementation, but a process of review or debate. So the student's core contribution would be some sort of written or oral reflection on either a real-world technology that was some case study in the class, or maybe class projects that were already going on in the course and the possible uses those could have if they were deployed in the real world. While many of the instructors in their reflections and their submissions converged on the idea of discussion being a good way to structure this sort of assignment, one of the things we noticed was that because many of the people contributing were computer science instructors, they would reflect that this is not the sort of thing that their students were expecting to see in their classes, and it's also not the sort of thing that they were used to teaching. Having a discussion course or a discussion section of a class, and then assessing people based upon their participation in discussion and meaningful reflections. It was clear that some time would also need to be spent not only on describing and giving examples in general of dual use, but also providing resources about and by the people who are harmed or affected by dual use cases, as well as these sort of soft skills of critical evaluation and review that students would need to be practicing. So there are several different dimensions of preparation that students would need to have this kind of exercise be valuable, which could take considerable amounts of time, hopefully valuable time as part of the course, but would require more than just a sort of one-day, one-off assignment. Next slide, please. As Emily mentioned, privacy presents an interesting challenge as part of a course in that, while providing initial definitions around privacy and anonymization can be fairly straightforward, actually implementing sort of what it means to make something require significant effort to de-anonymize somebody is actually very difficult. It's a technologically challenging thing to do, and it's something that there are very many unsolved questions about. So having students do that as part of a sort of technical assignment in the class is a little out of scope for most people. So most of the instructors suggested goals not of trying to implement or break an anonymizing or privacy preserving system, but instead training students to ask questions about how privacy might be violated or how it might be preserved when inspecting new systems. It was also mentioned by a couple of instructors that if it was possible, this might be a good place to bring somebody in external who does privacy as part of their day job, either by operationalizing it in some sort of software context or in their own research. Next slide, please. Going to our broader takeaways from this, one of the reflections from our participants summed up a recurring sentiment that I just wanted to share with you all, which is fundamentally, we need to connect this back to a value system. And as computer scientists, we're not trained in this at all. Looking at this in light of the news, not just from this past week, but the past many years around how technologies of language and information have wrought harm, I know that this reflection both rings true when I think about my field and disturbs me to my core. That fundamentally, we're looking at a situation where students don't have the same background or necessarily any common background in thinking about ethics and consequences of the technologies that they're deploying. Nonetheless, I think my tutorial leaders and I took hope in the enthusiasm and feedback and detail that we found in the tutorial participants. We were really shocked that we had, I think, over 100 participants with more than 60 sharing their reflections afterwards. It's many times what we expected when we first proposed this tutorial. And from their ideas, we had a few concrete recommendations that we're working to further refine in the curricula ideas that we hope to share out with some more concrete assignments as opposed to just the notes we have on the wiki right now. The first piece of this is that it's really important to choose studies for what you talk about in these classes that are concrete and meaningful. So while it might be easier to introduce some sort of mathematical measure with a toy problem, if you want to teach students that racism can be perpetuated by NLP systems, you need to be able to talk about racism in the classroom, which again is an unusual thing in a computer science focused curriculum. As a consequence of this point, students aren't likely to come through the door with equal vocabularies and backgrounds in history, sociology, and ethics to talk about and approach these topics. So it means that this class or the particular environment you're in for teaching will need to have exercises and resources to approach all of those different things to make the resulting work meaningful and to make the lesson stick. Because these assignments might look different from the rest of the curriculum, particularly for students who are more focused on computing, it's really important to give clear rubrics and guidelines for what effective participation and completion of these exercises looks like, so that students can not just have clear expectations for their grades, but also to free their focus, to focus on really challenging and often subjective content. Ideally, when doing this, and this is thinking about sort of accessibility and supporting students' individuality, it's important to give more than one channel to participate. In particular, vulnerable students, and this can be either students who are very new to this sort of material and this sort of conversation, or students who are very painfully familiar with the consequences of these kinds of technologies or of bias and so on, might need time to process and handle these topics on their own in a way to participate individually. And at the same time, having a conversation together among students is a really valuable way to help support and build new ideas. So providing both individual and group venues for participation is a really crucial thing to do, not just to sort of support class discussion, but to have students be able to support each other. Finally, while it's become more popular, I think, in NLP conferences and research environments to talk about ethics, it's really important that we start emphasizing to our students, to fellow instructors, and to practitioners in our field that the ability to critically analyze ethical harms of our technology isn't a side topic. It isn't a one-day lecture. It's a core skill that's necessary to do the work of NLP, and it's one that our students should be practicing regularly as part of all of their assignments and all of their work. Next slide, please. With that, I'd really like to thank my tutorial co-organizers, Emily, as well as Dirk, who's not here, as well as the participants, and this is the list of their names who shared their insights. I'll post the link in a second to the ACO wiki page where we have a more broad set of the notes that they gave us. And with that, I'll hand it back. Thank you so much.
Okay, so thank you all so much. At this point, I invite all of our panelists to turn their video back on, and we can take some questions from the audience. Since I'm screen sharing, I won't be able to also look at the questions as easily, so we will either select questions as they come in, or you all can raise hand and we'll select.
Just want to foreground something that's come up in the chat and in the Q&A, which is access to the materials. So Christine, I think you said towards the beginning in the chat that these slides will be available somewhere. And there's also questions about the recording.
Yeah, I'm not sure about the recording. I'll need to find out about that, but we do intend to make the slides available on the Ethics Committee's blog space, the open access blog space on the LSA website, and also, you know, whatever materials from their presentations that our panelists had. So stay tuned for that, hopefully in the coming weeks.
And there's a suggestion to maybe actually stop sharing the slides if we don't need them.
That's a great suggestion. Thank you for that.
I see a question from Andrew Cheng on the Q&A part there.
Oh, yes, good. Sorry, now I can actually see them better now that I'm not sharing anyway. So yes, Andrew says, how do we feel about found panel data? For example, using language data from news, archives, reality TV, Twitter, and YouTube, when speaker info can be anonymized, but the researcher is unlikely to be able to get consent. Does it make a difference if it's corpus analysis versus case studies or in-depth qualitative analysis? Does the particular intersection of identities of the subject matter? Anybody want to take that one?
I guess I want to jump in and just problematize a part of it a little bit more, which is If, for example, you're doing a study over Twitter and you include tweets in the paper that you've written up about the study, they are not anonymized because you can search them and go right back to that person's Twitter handle at least. And so we need to be very careful about what we mean by anonymization and at what point in the process.
It strikes me that these are public things, that they're never anonymized because they're out in the public domain to start with. I'd be interested in other panelists' reaction to that.
Yeah, I was also just going to say, I've had some doctoral students doing similar things, and our IRB officer always said, just check in, just check in, because the specifics of the project may well be what helps it decide whether or not it's the sort of thing that you do need consent for and so forth. And so many of these, social media type situations are idiosyncratic. So I'm going to put a plug out there for the IRB/REB folks to help you make those determinations.
If I could speak to Andrew's question, in particular to the issue of archival data, because it's actually a major source of work on documentation for many languages. Legacy materials that are archived or in private collections are the only source of language materials. And they were collected at a different time when our concerns about ethics were different. And so it's a big discussion. I don't have an easy answer to it, but I think one way that we've approached this is to reach back to the community and ask for permission and design the research in a way that is also meaningful to the community. So are you producing a corpus with those archival materials? Is that corpus going to be accessible to the community? And is it going to be in a format that they can use? So yes, you can use the software that linguists use. Can you transfer that into Excel or Word, or send it as a printout and make it accessible to people? So I think here again is the question of checking in, at least with archival documentation. Archivists are really in a good position to help you through that. But I'll emphasize also going to the community and talking to them about it.
I know someone has their hand raised, but I just want to highlight, if you're not looking at the chat, there's been some good resources thrown in there as well from other folks who have looked at this type of work. So I just wanted to highlight that.
Hi, so I am a US-based PhD student, so I'm not currently teaching as an instructor of record, although I have led a couple of discussion sections as part of my service requirements. And I'm just wondering, related to some of the issues that Xanda Schofield raised about including important examples of biased research in the classroom. I know that some of my classmates have spoken about, as international students, they don't feel well represented in a lot of the discussions about ethics and biases. And I was wondering if you guys have any ideas or resources about how to include a more diverse set of ethical issues in the classroom.
Thanks so much for asking that question. I think that it's a real challenge, in that I think a lot of the sort of initial discussion on initial momentum for how some of the research communities have handled this has come from a very US-centered group of people. And so often you're completely right. I think that a lot of the initial resources and links you'll find will come from research groups that are centered in the US and that have sort of US-based values. I think that there have been some additional links. One of the things I had mentioned from sort of a teaching perspective is, particularly when you're talking about case studies that focus on communities that are outside the US, there's this concept. This is actually related more to the disability community initially for how it was popularized, but more broadly of like sort of not about us without us. So that if you're in that sort of context, even if there isn't necessarily sort of a scholarly work that's specifically talking about dual use, it might be worthwhile to think about whether there are primary source documents or other things that represent the voices of the people you're talking about, and to use those as sort of the ethical jumping off point for the conversation, as well as just even sharing that initial idea that you were just reflecting on, which is that this idea that the values shared by US researchers are going to be shared across the world is not true. But I'd love to hear other people talk more about this.
I find that looking at things through a lens of a power analysis is really important here. Frequently in doing this work, I saw both Zenda and I at different conferences now are running the ethics review for publications in some of the NLP conferences. And one of the kinds of pushback we get is that this is just American imperialism. And that pushback tends to come from people who are in positions of power and privilege within their own local communities. And so figuring out how to have those conversations and understand what's going on, recognizing the fact that as USians, we do have a relative position of power with respect to the rest of the world in the academy, but still that when we're talking to people from other countries, to understand that there's going to be power relations there that we don't necessarily know about, and try to understand who we're talking to and how it fits in and who we need to be listening to from these other countries as well. Because it's clear that we're going to do better in this project the more that the perspectives are brought in are truly international and represent a broad range of contexts and communities. But at the same time, if in pulling in international perspectives, we just get the powerful people from all of the other contexts, that's also not going to work well.
As a brief interlude here before we keep going with our discussion, I'm going to mention the LSA Ethics Committee is meeting tomorrow, also at noon Eastern Time, and it is our, meant to be held during the LSA open meeting. So if you'd like to join, please let me know. You can email me. I'll put my email in the chat, or also Jeff Good, who will be the incoming ethics chair. And if you'd like to join the committee, we're always looking for more members. You can also email Jeff. I'll put our email addresses in the chat in a minute. So we have an open question from Will, who says, you highlighted the fact that IRBs are often grounded in biomedical sensibilities, and that this often conflicts with values such as recognizing language teachers and open science, even in low risk of harm studies. Is this an area where the Ethics Committee is active in providing guidance? Is there a document we can send to IRB folks to support our cases? I'll say that I believe that with, at least in the US, with the revisions to the common rule, a lot of that is now a little bit more, standardized in terms of the response by IRB boards. I know there's some, articles out there that I put the link in the chat to the LSA Ethics Statement, which has a huge page of resources following it. I can post that again. And I think those might be helpful. I'll also put in a plug for the American Anthropological Association, which I think also has a lot of really good material on ethics. And I would love to hear what others think as well.
I would weigh in, admittedly, with sort of more of a computer science department perspective than linguistics department perspective. But one of the things that I have observed is that sort of as this has gotten regularized with the common rule, there's still sometimes, I think, a tendency, because historically this has been so focused on biomedical research, for people to just sort of not share information with each other about the existence of IRB, or particularly things related to, say, exempt studies, or what it means to be exempt, that oftentimes that actually still means being reviewed by an IRB, even if that review process will go much more quickly and do not have the same sort of level of scrutiny or some of those guidelines. And I think that some of those gradations are really important to actually just start talking about, if nothing else. And that both like talking about it with the IRB at your institution, but also actually with other researchers, can help add some clarity on what actually should and shouldn't be going through those channels, what it means to go through those channels in an efficient way, and how to sort of smooth that process. I know I've had some interesting experiences talking to some of my colleagues who just weren't aware that IRB even applied to the research that they were doing, which I still find a little bit surprising that that happens. But I think that depending on how you conceptualize human participant research, and how well you know sort of the standard definitions in the modern era, that is actually a real challenge. And so, I mean, this doesn't really answer the question, but I would say it's good to sort of keep a conversation going with everyone who you know who might be a stakeholder in that, to start to figure out where those channels can specifically be made clearer. I think IRBs really do like to provide like the flowcharts and the extra documentation, be like, oh yes, you really should be getting a review if there's any lack of clarity there.
I want to jump in and add that the IRB process is really important, but it's also not the beginning and end of ethical considerations in our work. And I think that's true across all of these fields. From the NLP perspective, it's because the impact of the technology in the world is specifically and deliberately out of scope for the IRB. So it's not enough to get IRB approval. You can still do something you shouldn't be doing. And just because the IRB said it's okay doesn't mean it is, because the IRB is only focused on the people participating in the research. And I'm sure there's similar things in the other fields represented here as well.
Good point.
I'm having a hard time seeing it when people raise their hands for some reason.
I think it looks like,
her hand up.
Yeah.
Okay.
I had my hand up just with respect to that, to Will's question and what Sandra was saying. And what I found useful is to point people, my REP in particular, especially when I first started out as a student, to case studies that discuss best practices for ethics in my subfield. We were lucky that there is a lot of literature in the documentation subfield on that topic. So I just created a list and I said, this is what I'm proposing here is best practice. Check here, here, and here, and here. And it's about the part that we have to do of educating others about our own research, which they may not know the norms for. But I think I know a lot of linguists who serve on their ethics, universities ethics boards. So like if you really want to have a long-term impact on how a lot of these questions are taken up, then maybe consider doing service that way within your university.
So I've been given permission to unmute myself. This is Michal Temke Martinez at Boise State University. Thank you all for this panel. I wanted to ask a question. Jorge mentioned scaffolding ethics throughout the, I'm sorry, I'm taking us in a new direction. But Jorge mentioned scaffolding ethics throughout the curriculum. And I think that was a really, really important point. Maybe something that we could anticipate some pushback on from those who teach in areas that might be more theoretical and formal, where they may not see the point of or where ethics really fits in into a theoretical course. And I'm wondering if it's great to have people representing different subdisciplines here, and I'm wondering if you have some ideas for us to share with our colleagues on ways to incorporate conversations about ethics. This is something that's really important, not just for ethics, for justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, all those topics that linguists have a lot of things to say about, but we seem to rationalize saying them only in specific contexts. Right, and in teaching our students, undergrads and grad students. So if we can have some ideas.
I'll just have a quick comment. The challenge is to make yourself useful without making yourself objectionable on that, because you want to really bring this up in several contexts as a whole thing. But if people are not really open to that, then you could just be a pain in the neck or somewhere. So it has to be done subtly and gently, I guess, too. That's just a general comment.
One thing that kind of came up in the chat as well, one thing that I've been thinking about a lot is reframing, and this is what all of our presentations cover, this reframing this as like a crucial part of doing this. So just for me, it's just as important for students to understand these ethical issues as it is for them to understand what a 2x2 design is. That's the same level of importance. And so that needs to be, and so a couple of ways of doing, so we have power in our classrooms to show how that's important and incorporate that into our assessments and curricula in ways. But also, I think we need to have more venues and space for scholarly theorizing on this, right? So this is theoretical, right? This is all theory. This is all part of our scholarship, and it's intertwined, and it can't be separated from stats or whatever else stuff. And so I think thinking about how we can incorporate these things into things that are traditionally read as scholarship in a way that someone who's skeptical might be, maybe a spoonful of sugar makes the medicine go down is another way of thinking about it. But these are all types of strategies that I've been thinking about, especially as someone who's more junior and trying to like also do my research in a way that's read as significant to leaders in the field, right? So I think it's a challenging situation to be in, because as we're trying to be careful and take these, you know, ethical considerations into account, and issues of inclusion and diversity and justice and all those things, that type of work takes time, and it's done in a different way than following the hegemonic, oppressive, thoughtless ways of doing things. So maybe that's a little bit rude to say, but I think that it's important to think about.
I want to build on both of those comments and say that I think there's a framing here that we can use to say to our colleagues who think that this isn't relevant to their work, to basically say, yes, it is. You do have a chance to be a part of this. Like, this is an opportunity that's open to you, rather than this is something that you should be doing too. So instead of getting into the argument about whether or not it's relevant, just sort of assume that it is and say, hey, you want to be a part of this great project that is making our field, you know, more sort of justice forward, you can too. And I'm, you know, if you have the bandwidth, I would be happy to help you think about how you can too, kind of a thing.
So one of the things that I wanted to make sure that we covered was something that the panelists talked about in advance, which is I'd love for folks to share your perspective on how do you decide what goes to make room for this material? Because this is often a critique, like, oh, well, you know, what am I going to do? Throw out a key chapter in order to squish in something on ethics? You know, how do you all respond to that? Or what is the tactic that you take? Because I think that across this whole panel, we have heard things like infusing throughout, which, you know, I think we all agree with. So how do you make that happen, or how would you push back against that critique? Yeah, Jorge.
I think that this kind of, it's related back to Mihal's question of like scaffolding, right? And that was one of the points I was trying to make, is that you don't need to cover every single aspect of ethics in your class, because it may not be feasible, or otherwise you would just take the entire term to discuss this. But if you introduce students to key concepts one by one and slowly, one in one class, then you build on that, you again later you can go and have deeper discussions, right? So this idea of scaffolding it and like introducing it early, and kind of also helps with the issue of I don't need to throw out my entire curriculum to turn it into an ethics class, but it is still important to do that. And having those discussions even in an intro class by bringing in like samples from other languages that are not Indo-European languages, and like presenting them, but not presenting them kind of in the abstract, but presenting them like, this is this language from this community in this place. This is their sociolinguistic circumstances. Here's what you need to know about this. And I'm showing it to you because they do reduplication, but it's not divorcing people from the data, that I think would also really help.
I like to think in more practical terms of how in the world do I get across these concepts and get them cemented into people's minds. And it strikes me that if you have a certain amount of concept that you want to contribute, then it, like Jorge was alluding to, it doesn't have to be done all at once in one fell swoop. Like say, all right, I'm starting a course in tone analysis next week. So how do I incorporate this? Do I say, I'm going to forget one of the topics that I was going to be covered and just have the whole thing on ethics? Or do I have 5 minutes here, 5 minutes there? And you can actually cover quite a lot in those kind of things. But it does take some deliberation to do that. And by the end of the course, then students will be getting used to you doing that kind of a thing. And it will be, I think, more effective to do it bit by bit at a time than in one fell swoop as says, okay, here's one more thing. Now we could ignore it except for the final exam, possibly.
I think also I want to push back against the presupposition in that question that you're channeling to us, Christine, which is that there is a fixed set of things that is what goes into syntax 1 or psycholinguistics 1 or field methods, and you have to push one of those out. Like there's all kinds of stuff that we're not covering and a lot of flexibility. So I think to sort of let go of that framing of how could we possibly get rid of, you know, whatever this one topic is that's going to be pushed out. And then the other thing is I find it useful in my intro comp link class to do a specific lecture, or actually 2 lectures in a week on ethics early in the quarter. And then in every assignment, I basically have one question in there, which is sort of, let's look at this from an ethical point of view, sort of a what could go wrong type question. And that that sort of helps bring it in throughout and helps underscore that this is a core skill. And it also helps in that particular class, because that's a class that brings in computer science majors and linguistics majors and tries to do computational linguistics without a programming prereq. And so there's all kinds of pedagogical challenges. And one of my approaches is to put half of the assessment on the write-ups for each of the assignments. And so this is a writing part of it that sort of puts more weight on that side of things. So it's, you know, challenges can be opportunities too. And I think that's equally true here.
That's such a good point. And the comment in the chat about curriculum mapping is really important. So if the department decides that this is a need, figuring out how to infuse ethics across the whole curriculum is really important. Sorry, Jorge, I saw that you had your hand up.
I was just going to actually highlight that Nathan's comment, but also say that, you know, like we also have individual agency here, right? So like we determine what the course objectives are for the courses that we teach. And so it's not about making it like a kind of side topic that I'll touch on at certain points in a kind of marginal way because I feel obligated to do this. But if I build this as like, this is one of the outcomes for my students in my class, then you're mapping your learning outcomes to the activities that you're going to do, to the readings you're going to have them do. So like determining that this is a goal in and of itself that is worthy of pursuing in the context of your class, it's, I think, the way to also think about it, independent of whether your entire department buys into it or not, which is a different issue.
Absolutely. One thing that I wanted to mention, just because I saw this in the Q&A, and I feel like this actually dovetails with this conversation well, is when we're making space for these conversations, Anna Braden has this question about like, how do we make space for different ethical frameworks within the conversation that we're having? And I was actually really curious about asking whether Elaine wanted to talk about this more with respect to the worksheet assessment that she was doing. Particularly because I think a lot of the focus in having this conversation is to both welcome in different perspectives and also to sort of place emphasis on the fact that there are ethical considerations with real lasting harm, and it's like neutrality is sometimes not an option. And so I was wondering, not to put you on the spot, Elaine, if you had more thoughts on this question of sort of how to look at different ethical frameworks, whether you're trying to sort of maximize how many different ones you look at, and how do you reconcile as a researcher and as an instructor being ethical under one framework, but perhaps being unethical under another that might not be considered by the students?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's something that honestly, I will need to work more on to be able to incorporate. I give them a reading list at the beginning of the ethics session, and we read, we kind of start with the ethics statements from different societies, LSA and American Anthropological Association and MLA and a few others, and as kind of a starting point. As far as the role-playing exercise, for that, I'm mainly just trying to get them to think about the information that they need in order to make a decision. We also talk about resources that the university has for resolving power differential conflicts and where they can go for help for different kinds of problems. But as far as your question about the different ethical frameworks, that's something that I have a lot more work to do.
On the ethical frameworks question, when I taught my first ethics and NLP class, and this was the standalone elective format, I said, well, let's not reinvent the wheel. Let's go see what philosophers have said about ethics. And so we spent 2 weeks reading in the ethics literature. And I also didn't want to set it up so that there's like real philosophy and then non-European philosophy. So I very intentionally collected a whole bunch of links, and I said, okay, everyone's reading 2 things in here, and at least one of them has to come from a social address very different to your own. So that sort of got us bringing in a diversity of perspectives. And I found that the most useful things were not actually what came out of the European philosophical tradition, because a lot of that seems to start from this idea that we're balancing the needs of competing needs of different groups of people who all start from a level playing field. And that is not the case that we're dealing with in the actual world. And so looking at things that are grounded in movements of liberation and working towards justice and equity is, I think, a far better frame and a far more useful literature to go into than, you know, what do the European philosophers have to say about different kinds of ethics? And so that's my take on it now after working on this for a few years.
I think we have 3 minutes left in our session. So if anyone has another quick question or a closing comment, feel free.
I have one sort of question to the other panelists and comment, which is one of the things that we talk about are like all of these different sort of fairly large interventions in how we teach our courses. And I don't know if you've all experienced this, but it's a little hard to make changes to classes right now because we already have a lot of other format changes happening. And even in a regular year, it takes some time to, you know, run something, have it break all of the different ways. So what advice do you have for people who are trying to sort of transition how they're teaching these classes into something that has ethics more woven into the format of it?
I think I'll take that one in because I think the Endangered Languages class, and there's actually a really great article by Christine Hildebrand on how it's a good class for teaching students how to write and how to argue in favor or against something. So that is a very easy way of waving it into the class. It's like, I'm teaching you how to write and how to take a position and argue for or against and consider the pros and cons of different situations. So if you weave it into the class as kind of like a writing component and an argumentation component, which is a really important skill, the content then is ethics. And so that I think has helped, at least for my Endangered Languages class.
I think for a seminar class, it's really easy to just make that one of the reading questions or one of the questions that you talk about. And that's been super simple way to talk about all kinds of things like diversity, equity, inclusion, and ethics, and all kinds of important issues in a way that's woven in. So that's something that anyone can do, I hope.
I just want to add that it's really useful and helpful to be vulnerable with your students and to own the fact that you're trying something new and that you're learning with them. And if you don't have to pretend to already have all the answers, then there's a lot more room to like try out new things in a class.
I want to highlight something that Wesley Leonard wrote in the chat, which is, I'm going to try to say it quickly. A lot of the discussion of literature that explores or theorizes the ethical issues and the idea of referencing and assigning that literature for purposes of teaching about ethics, I observed that for the indigenous language ethics literature, especially in regards to language documentation, the vast majority is written by non-indigenous scholars who are coming from a point of view of an often colonial field. There's a concern of further othering already othered language communities and the perspectives within those communities told from their point of view. And I think this is super important. I try to include writings, like, and this is something that Xanda talked about as well, like including writings and perspectives from people like who are part of these communities. Also in my class, we talk a lot about doing experimental work in a community that you're a part of, because that's really relevant to my own experience. And if things look really different and your ethical issues can look really different when you're part of the community yourself. But I wanted to sort of highlight that as an important point. And who we're saying is we and them, and who are the studied subjects and who are the studiers is an important question to talk about.
And I'll say that the work that Wes has been doing and other people like Jenny Davis and the entire SIG group has made it possible for us to have these discussions and to assign those readings from people. There is a new, it's in Spanish and I think it's being translated into English, but there is a whole new LDNC issue on what it's like to work in your own community. So for people who are both indigenous and we're doing research on their own languages, which is such an important perspective to have, especially for language documentation. Yeah, thank you, Wes. That's a very good point.
Well, it's 1:30, so thank you all so much for joining us today to have these conversations and to share insights. Thank you so much to the panelists for all of the great concepts, ideas, strategies, resources that have been shared today. And stay tuned again on the LSA Ethics blog space for hopefully quick posting of some of these materials. And thank you all for your kind words. Have a great rest of the day and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you all.
Bye.